Good evening, everybody, and welcome to a very special evening here on Hallows Eve. We have two Sherlock Holmes author panels this evening. And on panel number one, we have Alistair Duncan, Martin Daley, Orlando Pearson, Richard Ryan, Susan Knight, and Tom Turley. And we will be having a second panel in 2 hours' time coming up a bit later. So I'm going to do a little introduction to MX Publishing and to who we are, and then I'm going to go straight into the panel and let the panelists introduce themselves. My name is Steve Emmets, and I'm the founder and managing director of MX Publishing. So we were founded in 2006, and we are the largest Sherlock Holmes publisher in the world, pretty much by any which way you care to measure it. We have over 120 authors that have written for our little publishing house, and we have over 400 titles. I think you can probably count it to maybe over 500 now. If you look at the titles sales around the world, over 2 million books in various different formats, from print to ebooks, and increasingly in audio. We're an ethical business. It's a social enterprise, and you can go and visit our website and find out a little bit more about us. But we support three major programs: Stepping Stone School, which we'll talk about in a little bit, Happy Life Children's Home in Kenya, and the United Nations World Food Programme. You can see there a picture of my wife, Sharon, at Happy Life Children's Home. We'll actually be heading out there to Kenya again on the 15th of December to spend a couple of weeks with the kids. We missed it last year due to COVID, but we're back out there again. So Undershore is a very interesting project that we support. Stepping Stone School has been renamed Undershore recently, back to its original name. We've been working with them since 2009, and I became a patron of the school in 2016. Through one of our big projects, which we can talk about in a second, we've raised over $85,000 for the school. That probably will net up over $95,000 before the end of this year. And we do quite a bit of events and awareness with the school, and sometimes, COVID permitting, we also do some events at the school as well. It is the former home of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and I'm sure we can ask Alistair a little bit about the wonderful building and the history as well when we get into the panel. One of our biggest projects is the MX Book of New Sherlock Holmes Stories. It has more than 750 now in it. It's edited by David Markham, who's taking part in our second panel tonight. We've released 30 volumes, or at least 27 are out, and another 3 are coming out in November over the last 6 years. We have a number of award-winning novels as part of our portfolio, and one of the first to win a major award is The Vatican Cameos by Richard Ryan, who's on our panel tonight. There's a lovely quote there from a good friend of MX, Lee Child, who's helped us out on a number of different things, including participating in the MX book. And we get regular endorsements from best-selling authors like Lee and John Lescroart for novels like David's Eye of Hecker. We also do some award-winning graphic novels. Petter Koppel is one of our most famous graphic artists, and we have 4 of his books that have been translated from the original Czech. And as you can see from the artwork here, they're simply stunning stuff. We also have a number of award-winning non-fiction writers. So not going to take too much glory away from Alistair later, but the Norwood author there was the winner of the Howlett Award. I can't remember the year, but Alistair will know it straight away. It's one of the first 3 Arthur Conan Doyle biographies. This year, we've seen a really fascinating project from David McGregor, who appears in our second panel this evening. He's called it his magnum opus. It's The Hero with 1,000 Faces. We might ask Alistair about that, because Alistair's had a look at volume 1, certainly. We actually got such a good reaction from it. We were given permission by the BBC to use Benedict Cumberbatch's photo, albeit not on the front cover. It appears on the spine. And we've had some major endorsements from some leading Sherlockians for this particular project. Both of those volumes are out this year. We've done some performance biographies, 3 for Benedict and 1 for Jeremy Brett, which was our best-selling title of 2020. Audiobooks I mentioned before, more than 250 of our books now are out on audio. An interesting project that's just coming out in November this year is our first step into what's called the light manga style. Very, very non-traditional Holmes, this one, so maybe eliciting a few frowns from our panel. But this is The Beasts of London from an author, Swiss author called Janina Woods, and has some amazing artwork in it from a Malaysian artist called Ryu from Lepus is her title, and that comes out in November. We've also got a big partnership with Mondadori. So we've been working with them for 7 years so far. More than 40 of our titles have sold out through them, and we've now contracted about another dozen as well. And several million dollars worth of books have been sold by Mondadori as part of this collection. We also are the providers of Dear Holmes mysteries. So Dear Holmes is a very interesting concept in the USA for letters in the mail where you can solve the clues. And this is our 3rd year we've been working with them and provided over 30 cases for them so far. Also worth mentioning is an incredible project called The Art of Sherlock Holmes, created and curated by Phil Growick. We've had 55 pieces of art created as part of this project, each one of them created from a Sherlock Holmes story, and you can see 3 of those pieces of art on the page there, including my very favourite, don't tell anybody else, the one on the left-hand side, the Return of the Woman, a fantastic, beautiful, beautiful piece of art. It's actually 3 different actresses who've played Irene Adler morphed into a single painting, and it's a very large painting as well. I think it's about 1.5 meters tall. So without further ado, onto our panel. So at that point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let's see how we're getting on with people arriving. So we have lots more people have arrived. If you would like to pop into the chat window which city and which country you're from. We have Edith has told us that she's from Montreal, so welcome, Edith. So if we start at the top left-hand corner on our panel, Alistair, would you like to say hello and tell everybody a little bit about your Sherlock Holmes related writing?
Okay, my name is Alistair Duncan, and as Steve is often fond of pointing out, all of this is my fault, which we shall come back to later. I've written 5 books under MX, 2 books largely about Sherlock Holmes, and 3 biographies of Arthur Conan Doyle. I used to sit on the governing council of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London. I'm still a member of the Arthur Conan Doyle Society and the Sydney Passengers. And as Steve alluded to earlier in the slides, I have won the Sherlock Holmes Society of London's literary award once and been shortlisted for it a further 2 times. And my favourite story in the entire canon is The Sign of 4, which I'll be happy to talk about a bit later.
Thank you, Alistair. So next up, Orlando, with a very fetching Baker Street background there, sir.
Absolutely. So I'm Orlando Pearson. I devised the Redacted Sherlock Holmes series. So far, there have been 6 volumes of short stories. There's volume 6. I can't see that very well there. And I produced some plays, and I've just brought a novel out. My novel is called Dark Arts, Dark Acts. It introduces Sherlock Holmes to, amongst others, Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, Joseph Goebbels, and P.G. Wodehouse. This is the first time I suspect that P.G. Wodehouse and Joseph Stalin have been in the same story. The premise of my stories is that Sherlock Holmes, some events have occurred that have been so extraordinary that Sherlock Holmes must have been there. He's been redacted from the record. And so I restore Sherlock Holmes to the historical events. And doing that, I've found increasingly I use Mycroft, because a lot of my stories are about diplomatic history, and Holmes is a little bit of, has his limitations as as Watson establishes early in their friendship, whereas for Mycroft, Mycroft's specialism is omniscience. So having somebody who's omniscient and high up in the British government is quite a useful combination to have. My novel's just come out, and I'll be doing a play called A Perilous Engagement, also featuring Mycroft Holmes on December the 11th, which we Zoomcast then.
Fantastic. And your short stories seem to be quite popular on audio.
Yes,
yeah,
very
it's
lucky.
Yeah,
Very lucky with my readers. They've done. I've had 3 different readers doing my stories. They've done it very well.
Fantastic. And next up is Susan Knight, calling all the way from Dublin.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Susan Knight, my name. I started writing Mrs. Hudson stories without a view necessarily to getting them published, just because I was drawn to the character. I thought you needed a feminine view of things. The men have been up to it long enough. So I started writing the short stories. That's Mrs. Hudson Investigates. And I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with them. And then I got in touch with Roger Johnson of the London-based Sherlock Holmes Journal. And he immediately said, send them to Steve Emmett's. And so I did. And I was delighted when Steve picked up on them and said, yes, certainly we'll publish those. I haven't had experiences like that with publishers before, I have to say, Steve. You know, it was a breath of fresh air there. So I brought this out. It's also an audiobook. And then following that, we brought out Mrs. Hudson Goes to Ireland, because I thought, since I live in Ireland, it's very logical that she would come and visit the country here. So she gets up to all sorts in Ireland. She gets involved with a forced wedding and has to try and put a stop to that. But in the meantime, there's a ghastly murder. So she's forced to involve herself in that. And then there's a follow-up to that called Mrs. Hudson Goes to Paris, which is going to come out, I think, on Valentine's Day next year. Again, Mrs. Hudson goes over to Paris with her sister, who's very concerned about her son, who wants to be an artist. So they get involved with the art scene there, Toulouse-Lautrec and the fin de siècle and all that. So great fun is had. But again, unfortunately, there's a ghastly murder in the middle of it all, which she has to try and deal with. So I'm hoping that people will enjoy that book. I enjoyed very much writing it. I might talk about the research involved in both those particular novels if people are interested in that. And the other thing I've done is contribute 6 stories so far. One's not, well, I'm waiting to see if David Markham likes it, but 5, and the one that's in the pot. For the MX book of new Sherlock Holmes stories, and writing in the voice of Dr. Watson for that. So I very much enjoyed doing those as well. So that's as far as I've got so far.
And Susan, the premise behind Mrs. Hudson Investigates is that Holmes and Watson are busy doing something else, and Mrs. Hudson has to take up the mantle to do the investigating.
Well, that's the very first one. That the lads have gone off to the West Country, and a distraught young woman arrives at the door begging for help, and Mrs. Hudson is able to. Some of Holmes's powers of deduction have rubbed off on her, so she impresses the young lady with her own powers of deduction, and then she's dragged off to solve the very first mystery. And I think after that she gets a bit of a taste for it all. So
fantastic. And next up is Tom Turley. Hi, Tom.
Hi. Thank you, Steve. Steve asked the panelists to bring some of their favorite books. That was easy for me because this is the first actual book I have published. It's called The Sherlock Holmes and the Crowned Heads of Europe, and it involves our heroes in 4 interrelated cases between 1888 and 1913 that involve European royalty and some of the events leading up to the First World War. It has gotten pretty good reviews so far and maybe sold 4 or 5 copies. I haven't kept up with that yet, but I have actually been publishing pastiches since 2014 with MX. The others are all short stories. I've had about half a dozen published in the anthology, the MX book of new Sherlock Holmes stories. And a couple have appeared in the Art of Sherlock Holmes volumes, coupled with paintings by some of the artists there. Both of those involve Dr. Watson's wives, which is another of my interests. I've written stories on all three of Watson's wives. I know there's debate about how many he had, but I'm going with the Baring-Gould approach and the canonical approach, which ends up with three. One of them, The Adventure of the Tainted Canister, is the first one that I did, and it will live in infamy among traditional Sherlockians for reasons I won't go into here. But David Markham, after I submitted that for the MX anthology, didn't take it, but in spite of that, he did encourage me to continue writing things that were maybe a little less heretical. And so I've kept on and hope to continue, publishing at least short stories. I don't have any immediate plans for another novel, but the Crowned Heads book involves so much research that I'm still trying to recover from some of that. So that's where things stand now. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tom. And on to Martin. Martin, your series of short story collections actually features a parallel inspector. Tell us a little bit about that.
Hi, Steve. Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. As Steve said, I, like colleagues, I have sort of two fingers in the MX pie, as it were. I'm living in Carlisle in Cumbria, which is in the north of England. For colleagues outside of the country, it's just about 8 miles short of Scotland, to give you an idea of where I am. And my inspector is Cornelius Armstrong. And we've done, so far we've done 4 books in the Armstrong series. He is a contemporary of Holmes, and his stories revolve around adventures in the city of Carlisle, in and around the city of Carlisle, in the late Victorian Edwardian period. I first introduced him in a pastiche novel involving our two friends. I particularly didn't want to make Armstrong the classic buffoon inspector, because I wanted to give him adventures of his own, and that's how he's panned out. So I love doing those stories. And like colleagues, I also have stories in David's the MX anthologies, which are great. It's like being in the best tribute band in the world, isn't it? It's great. And incidentally, I noticed with David, he lists in the books contributors, and he puts them in alphabetical order. And in the last one, of course, my surname is Daley, and the chap below me is Arthur Conan Doyle, which is, I'm not sure, I think it was Tom earlier mentioned the heresy. I'm not sure how that plays out, but so it's great fun writing both series, as it were. And I would certainly endorse what Susan said a moment ago. Dealing with Steve and MX is just a breath of fresh air. It means that we can concentrate on our writing, which is what we love to do, rather than messing around with all the peripheral stuff that invariably gets in the way. I'm sure we've all experienced that with other authors. And of course, when we are contributing through our work to such great causes, not gonna lie, feels good. So that's a little bit about me.
Fantastic. Thanks, Martin. And last but definitely not least, Richard, you're not dialing in from New York. You're dialing in from somewhere else, aren't you?
Dialing in from Virginia. The grandkids are here, and so are my wife and myself. But I've written 6 pastiches for MX now. 5 are out, and the latest one, the 3 May Keep a Secret, is due out November 29th. They're all traditional pastiches, focusing on different events. The first one, the Vatican Cameos, obviously is an untold tale from the canon and all the rest are my own creations. I also, as you know, work as an editor for Steve. I like to consider myself a consulting editor. And if I can mention the competition, I'm editing 2 anthologies for Belanger Books right now, 1881 and 1882, that attempt to fill in the voids in the canon. As we know, Holmes and Watson met in 1881, and the only case they worked on in that year definitely was the Sign of Four. They may or may not have worked on the Resident Patient. There's a lot of disagreement about that. And in 1882, according to Doyle, they worked on no cases. So these are collections of short stories that attempt to fill in the void of 1881 and 1882, and they plan to run the series all the way through, I believe, 1914. So I'm busy.
Yeah, very, very busy, Richard. And you neatly have brought me on to, by mentioning the Sign of Four, onto our first question of the evening, which is the favourite story within the canon and why. And if we go back to Alistair, you mentioned the Sign of Four there. Why does the Sign of Four rate so highly for you?
I think it's fairly unique amongst the stories in that it doesn't require flashbacks and Holmes is mostly in it. If you look at the long stories, Holmes is largely absent from the Hound, and the other two feature quite lengthy flashbacks in which Holmes doesn't feature. So I like it for that reason, that, you know, the hero is largely there. I also like it because it sort of ticks a lot of the literary romantic boxes, you know, buried treasure or hidden treasure, damsel in distress, romance, etc. for Watson. And it's one of the things about the stories, I think, that people forget is that for most of the written stories, Holmes and Watson were not living together in 221B. And so it's nice to have that story when they are genuinely living together before Watson goes and gets married and upsets Holmes.
You mentioned the Hound then. That brings us neatly on to Orlando. Orlando and I were lucky enough to see the Hound of the Baskervilles adaptation that's just been running in London now, with the absolutely fantastic Luke Barton playing Holmes and Watson on alternate days. And the day that we were there, he was playing Watson, and actually seeing it as a stage adaptation shocked me a bit at quite how much of the dialogue is Watson in that one. So as you said, Alistair, you know, Holmes is copiously absent in almost the entire play, although the way they did it was quite nice, because they sort of did a preamble ahead of the Hound. But it's your favourite, isn't it, Orlando?
I was going to talk about Red-Headed League. Actually, I think someone else was going to do Hound of the Baskerville.
Yeah, I think I mentioned the Hound, Steve, actually.
Well, there's my first mistake of the evening. See, it's live, ladies and gentlemen. You see, it's not recorded. It's live.
Can we edit that out afterwards?
There you go. So I can't edit that out. So yes,
okay.
Martin.
Yeah, well, I must confess to colleagues or to visitors to the call, I was going to pick the Sign of the Four as well, but Alistair beat me to it. But the reason I like, I suppose part of the reason I like the Hound and the Sign of the Four is because there's more of them than the short stories. And but with the Hound, it's quite interesting. I think if you pressed me for who is my two favorite literary characters of all time, are obvious as they are to us all. If you pressed me which one I prefer most, I would probably say Watson rather than Holmes. And as we're saying, certainly in the Hound, he's probably in the Hound, or he takes more of a key role than the great man himself. So it's just the classic. All the ingredients are there. You know, they're there in Baker Street to start with. They have to travel. There's a mystery there. There's plenty of action, and our friend Watson arguably takes the lead role. So yeah, I'm a big fan of the Hound as well.
Fantastic. Back to Orlando, Red-Headed League.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think the Red-Headed League is one of the very few stories which starts with a peculiar event that's about 11 o'clock in the morning. And by about midnight, you have a prisoner being led off in chains. And the chain of deduction that goes on. And Watson himself says it's a very long chain of deduction, but every link rings true. And a lot of the other Conan Doyle stories end up with Holmes not catching the villain because he disappears, or finding there's no crime at all. But here we start off with a peculiar event of a man finding his office is being closed, and we end up with another man being led off in chains. And the logical link from event to event to event rings absolutely true. And he does it all in about 12 hours. It's not much longer than that. And I just think that if you wanted to give somebody one Arthur Conan Doyle short story which says it explains the fascination of Sherlock Holmes, that's it. It does have all the logic and all the drama and all the humour as well. It's the funniest story of all of them. But it's been my favourite for a long time, and I'm sure it'll remain so for a long time further.
Fantastic. And Richard, you've gone for the Valley of Fear.
Right. I'm very fond of the American connection in that particular story. And the whole Molly Maguire movement, which Conan Doyle calls the Scourers, it's unique in that it's really it's bifurcated very much like some of his other tales, but this is a clear distinction between setting and everything else. And then we come back at this little segue at the end where Holmes gets a note, and the note says, "Dear me, Mr. Holmes, dear me," and we all know who the note is from. And I think, it kind of touches the past and presages the future in that one novel. And the characterizations are just tremendous, throughout.
And Susan, you've gone for the adventure of the Norwood build-up.
Yeah, well, my problem is that my favorite Holmes story tends to be the one I've just read. So, I read the Norwood Builder quite recently, and I just think it's a terrific fiendish plot, that this guy has been holding this grudge for so many years, and at last he finds a way of getting his revenge on the woman who threw him over, and by trying to get her son accused of his murder. So it's just such a terrific, wicked plot. And then of course Sherlock Holmes discovers that when the house is burned down and there's a body apparently found, and it's supposed to be this Jonas Oldacre who's made out his will to leave everything to the young fella, and of course that's not the story at all. And that I don't know if you want me to give you a spoiler about how Holmes actually finds out that it's his usual cunning, let's say. So I like that very much anyway.
I would suspect that with the audience that we have for these author panels,
they probably know it anyway.
Yeah, we probably don't need to worry too much about spoilers. But it is hard to remember the plot lines of all 60 Conan Doyle stories. I would say that with the tens of thousands of pastiches that have been written now as well, storylines and spoilers are probably relevant for the wider external canon, and we'll probably come back to that a bit later. Tom, you've gone for Speckled Band.
Yes, when I was first reading Sherlock Holmes stories as a child, probably 12 years old or so, I had a phobia about snakes, and that story fit right into it. I've gotten over that in later years, particularly since my daughter for a while had a hobby of breeding corn snakes. But anyway, I think not only the horror element itself, but the fact that Dr. Roylott was such a wonderful villain, and just the atmosphere of the story, which I think has come across very well in some of the adaptations. And then ultimately, I wrote a story myself that draws very heavily on the speckled band. Some of the others that have influenced me have been some of the political and diplomatic cases later in the canon. But I think my favorite, and certainly the first one, other than Hound, that made a great impression on me was the speckled band. So
I always like this question about the favorite story, but I also do like it when people rank the stories from the best to the worst.
yeah.
So dare I ask the question from the panel? Does anybody want to come in on this one first? Is which of Conan Doyle's stories do you think doesn't quite come up to muster?
I'm never been a fan of the Mazarin Stone.
That often comes at the bottom of the rankings.
I ranked them last year, and I put Mazarin Stone bottom. I think there's more controversy. I found it much easier finding the top ones. There's so many to choose from, whereas the Mazarin Stone is pretty awful. I think I have heard it described as the worst ever short story, but I'm not sure about that. But it's the worst ever short story to be permanently in print.
For me, it's all. I mean, I agree with Orlando, but for me, the other two that I always struggle with are the Creeping Man and the Sussex Vampire. I find them both very weak.
Well, it's interesting that you've got those two there, Alistair, because the very first book, you said we'd come back to it. It is all your fault that we're here. The very first book that we published as MX in the Sherlock Holmes genre was Eliminate the Impossible by Alistair. And you go through the entire canon, and you're quite frank about your opinions on the different stories. So anybody that would like to delve deeper into which of the stories don't cut the mustard, then if you pick up Eliminate the Impossible, then you'll get a quite good and frank assessment of them all. What would you rank as the top sort of 2 or 3, Alistair? You've said that you like The Sign of 4, but are there some others that you would say are really representative of Conan Doyle's excellence?
Well, some of them have been covered already, so I wholeheartedly agree about the Red-Headed League and the Speckled Band. I quite enjoyed Silver Blaze, but now I'm on the spot. I'm running through them in my head. I think those are particular favourites. I think I probably also enjoyed the Greek Interpreter quite a lot.
Fantastic. And one of the subjects that often comes up with this is the research that needs to go into. We'll come back to Alistair in a moment, but because you're the one non-fiction person on the panel, if we go back to Orlando and ask, with your research, your particular take on Holmes is to weave him into actual historical events. How do you do most of your research?
I think people ask me how I find time to write. So I'm a full-time chartered accountant, or in American terms, a CPA. So that's quite a busy job. And I don't actually find writing particularly difficult, because I've got the characters, I've got a keyboard, so I can just sit down and write. But I find researching does take a lot of time, and getting an idea is the difficult bit. And the ideas come by chance. So my novel Dark Arts, Dark Acts was suggested to me by a neighbour who'd heard of a serial killer at work on the Berlin Underground in the years 1940 to 41. Now, the difficulty was getting Sherlock Holmes into Berlin in 1940, 1941, where there weren't too many tourist tickets going for free. And I had to research how he might have got there. And I then had to research the murders, and I found a very good, very solid, very unemotional account of the serial killer. He was a very prolific killer. He killed 8 people, and he admitted to killing 8 people, attempting to commit 6 others, and there were numerous other assaults as well. And of course, once you've got Holmes in Berlin in 1940, you start looking around what else is going on. And one of the people who was in Berlin in 1940-41 was P.G. Wodehouse. So I thought, well, I can stick P.G. Wodehouse in. And then once you start doing that, the whole thing grows. And you come to a question not of what you include, but what you exclude, because you could go on and on and on, adding more and more details. And I read around stuff. So the books that influenced me on this was the book I read about the Berlin serial killer, plus a book I read about an English lady who lived in Berlin and Bavaria, throughout the Second World War. She was married to a German. She's called Christopher Bielenberg, and she wrote a set of memoirs called The Fastest Myself. I read a book by Britain's most prolific hangman, who was a man called Albert Pierpoint, and that described a journey going to Portugal in 1940. And once again, there weren't many tourists going to Portugal in 1940, and there were special planes running for people who had to make journeys at that time. And Wikipedia is an enormous time saver, because you can look people up, and then you can see within the stub, oh, there's somebody else I need to look up as well. And so I was able to investigate. I was able to look at the biographies of the people of the policemen who actually worked on the case of the Berlin subway murderer, one of whom himself subsequently got hanged for treason. So I could look into that as well. And I did find it very hard work. It took me a lot longer to write a not all that long novel compared to my short stories. But it was very satisfying at the end when it came out. It's just come out now. I tried to show it on screen a minute ago. I don't think that's showing better now. You can see the names and the faces. And I did find researching and trying to bring life to the characters, because Holmes meets Churchill and Wodehouse and Anthony Eden and Stalin. Stalin turns out to be an absolutely avid Sherlock Holmes fan, which he was a Sherlock Holmes fan, so to make life a little bit easier. Stalin was actually considered himself more of a poet than a politician, and he did publish poetry. So it was fun researching, and I think the tone is quite light for quite a serious subject, but it is a fun thing to do, but it is hard work. You've got to be patient, and you do occasionally find yourself. I think you do find yourself going up blind alleys at some point, but you just keep on going until you find what you want.
You mentioned P.G. Wodehouse there. I think when we did the interview for Dark Arts, Dark Acts, I smiled at the link, because P.G. Wodehouse was great friends with Bertram Fletcher Robinson, who was the assistant plot producer on The Hound, and a good friend of Conan Doyle's. And Wodehouse and Robinson actually wrote 4 very satirical plays, which until recent times, several of them had been lost. And one of the descendants of Bertram Fletcher Robinson, a chap called Paul Spiring, who Alistair and I know, he actually found copies of those, and they even had nicknames for each other. So P.G. Wodehouse called Bertram Fletcher Robinson Bobbles, and the nickname for P.G. Wodehouse was Plum. So we reproduced those 4 satirical plays as a book called Bobbles and Plum a few years ago. Jumping across to Susan, I remember when we did a couple of interviews with you around your books, we talked about not really the fact finding, but more the challenges of writing in a Victorian style.
Yes, getting the language right is always a preoccupation of mine, but I've read a lot of 19th century authors and tried to get the language spot on and not too many anachronisms. I've got a wonderful reader that I give my stories to, and he's forever picking up on things. So for example, I had the opening of Mrs. Hudson Goes to Paris telling, because it's written in the first person, and she tells us that she has itchy feet. Well, he came back to me pretty quickly and he said to me, if she had itchy feet, it meant she had some horrible infection or sores on her feet in those days, because the term didn't mean you wanted to travel until into the 20th century. So I had to get rid of that and put something else. So it's always good to have somebody picking you up on things. I also had, in the most recent story that I sent to David Markham, I had Holmes discombobulated when a beautiful woman throws herself into his arms. But of course, he couldn't have been discombobulated in those days. So that was another thing I had to change, sadly. But because it would have been perfect. It would have been just how he was. But he had to end up being discomforted instead. So there we are. So that's the... But regarding the other research, I find that fascinating. But I do think, like Orlando, that you have to be very careful not to get too involved in the research and too carried away by it, because what, excuse me, what you find absolutely fascinating, the readers might find it sort of drags them down a bit. So you have to sort of limit yourself to the interesting things. But regarding the Mrs. Hudson Goes to Ireland, I got great mileage out of a book called The Burning of Bridget Cleary by a woman called Angela Burke, which is fascinating. Fascinating background to that time in Ireland when superstition reigned very strongly in the minds of country people. So that was for that. And for the French one, I read quite a lot of, I hope you can't hear the jingling that's going on. I'm getting messages sent in. And also fireworks going off outside, so that there isn't a riot going on. It's just the bangs that you can hear are fireworks. But no, so I read a wonderful book called Toulouse-Lautrec and the Fin de Siècle, and quite a few other books based on that time, and also a contemporary novel called Trilby, which some of you might know, which is slightly earlier than my period, but it all contributed to it. But again, then you have to limit what you put in, because as I said, you don't want to bog the story down with fascinating information when you need to get on with the plot.
Fantastic. And Tom, you really focused on European heads of state for your book. Was there a particular resource that you found useful?
Well, yes, but let me first comment on Susan's statement there. I think that is a very good point. I had been studying this particular group of European monarchs since I was in high school, shortly after they were still around. But I got a little bogged down when the first story in the book, The Case of the Dying Emperor, was published in ebook form. There were 117 footnotes or endnotes that went with it, and about that many pages of text. And Daniel Victor, who I've gotten to know, personally, and who actually read the story, said, you need to get rid of that. You need to, do a bibliographic essay. And that was a very good suggestion, and I think kept the book in its final form from bogging down in too much detail, because I tend to get a little obsessive about research. The comment about Wikipedia is also interesting because you do have to be careful with it. There's a lot of misinformation there, but actually you ask about sources for the book. Probably the most useful source I had was John Rawls' biography of Kaiser Wilhelm, which is, I think, 3 volumes and about 3,900 pages. And the way I found out about that actually was seeing it cited in an article on Wikipedia. So it's a fairly recent biography, and probably the last word that will need to be said about Kaiser Wilhelm. But my background is in history, and really, as I said, this particular group of monarchs I had always found fascinating. And so the sources were there. I think the biggest trouble I had was probably just boiling all of that down into something that would be suitable for Sherlock Holmes stories, and incorporating Holmes and Watson into those events in a way that made sense from a Sherlockian perspective as well as a historical perspective. And I hope the book does that. But, my trouble again was just not trying to say too much, or trying not to say too much.
Yeah, I think one of the comments that's been mentioned in the chat is that when you do the research and you find these amazing books that help you along the way. They become
Right.
treasures. They become treasures that sit on your bookshelf, and you look back at them as friends that have helped you along the way.
Right.
Richard, I wanted to touch on, if you don't mind, the Vatican cameos, because I think it was such a unusual way of creating a story set in two different centuries. What helped you with the research on that?
The research on that took longer, I think, than writing the book. I'm a medievalist at heart, and I also have an avid interest in the Renaissance. And when I was working at the newspaper and handling the arts section, a gentleman who sat next to me, Michael Frezzola, was, he was one of my big sources for the art references. Michael would write a tremendous column every week, and he was kind of my go-to guy when it came to art references and Renaissance art. And what I wanted to do with the Vatican cameos was basically, as I used the term bifurcated earlier, two of Doyle's novels have, Holmes, and then we branch off into another adventure altogether, including the Valley of Fear. What I want to do was just kind of riff on that, but instead of having a section with Holmes and a section with the villain or someone else, I wanted to keep them interwoven. So I tried to do chapter by chapter. So we have all the odd chapters are Holmes in 1901, all the even chapters are, Michelangelo in 1501. And it was a lot of research to get through that, because we had to research the papacy, we had to research the Borgias, we had to research the art of making cameos. There was a lot that went into that. And I was just reading constantly for about 6 to 8 months to get ready to write it.
And Martin, your stories are all set in and around Carlisle. Presumably a lot of the research involved was trying to put yourself back 100 years into the locations around Carlisle.
Absolutely, Steve. Yeah, I get a lot of inspiration from the area and family members as well. Actually, some of the Armstrong stories. What I do is with some of the stories, I take Carlisle is a very, very historic city. It's 2,000 years old, dates back to the Romans, and has been fought over by pretty much everybody. So it has an awful lot of history, and that gives me a lot of inspiration and a lot of ideas. For example, Tom mentioned Kaiser Wilhelm earlier, that a lot of people won't know, why would they? But Kaiser Wilhelm had links to the particular area because he was friends prior to the war with the Earl of Lonsdale in the Lake District. So one of my stories is called The Kaiser's Assassin. So one of his actual visits to the area, I've got this fictitious story about somebody who's trying to bump him off. So that's an example. The next Armstrong story, again, our American friends, I don't know if you know this or not, but back in the day, Buffalo Bill toured quite extensively throughout Europe, and he came to Carlisle, came to this area. So what a great backdrop. I think this was 1904. I think I'm right in saying. What a terrific backdrop for a story, and similarly with the Holmes stories, the latest short story I have in one of David's books is called The Sebastopol Clasp, and that was David invited me to do a little postscript to the story, so I won't spoil it, but that was inspired strangely by my great grandfather, who was a soldier in the Crimean War. So that's another inspiration, and I'm interested in David's biography of Watson, because he has him being born in Stranraer in Scotland, which is just over the Scottish border, not a million miles away from where we are, and we're lucky enough to have a little holiday home up there. So that inspired me. I'm doing a story for David's latest book that's hopefully going to be out in spring of next year, in where we have Watson coming back to his home area. So there's always something in my local area or family history that gives me inspiration, both with the Armstrong stories or with the Holmes and Watson stories.
And finishing off with a different style of research, heading over to Alistair. So with non-fiction, a few people in the chat have touched upon the need to triangulate your research if you're going to use Wikipedia and various other sources. But if my memory serves me right, and you've clarified the date, 2011 for the Norwood author. One of the reasons cited for that winning the award was you unearthing some brand new facts about Conan Doyle that nobody else had done before. What were your primary sources of research?
Oh, contemporary newspapers, without a doubt. It's been very lucky over the last probably 10, 15 years that lots of newspapers of the time have been digitized and made accessible through websites. So, in the old days, you'd have to sit there, and I did this for the Norwood author, you'd have to sit with microfilms, sort of spinning the machines away and hoping you found something and hoping things didn't miss. But with the excellent digitization work that's been done of those contemporary papers of the time, with optical character recognition, you can very swiftly search for subjects that interest you very quickly across decades worth of newspapers. So not only was it easier to get to those newspapers, particular newspapers from other countries like Australia, etc., it was also incredibly easy to search them at speed for things that you were interested in. So, I may sound flippant when I say this, but you could go to some sites and just put in a start year and end year Conan Doyle, press go, and then you could get your entire book out of the search results because so much would come up and you just simply plow your way from one end to the other. And then there would be so many leads in those newspapers that would take you to other newspapers, potentially to other writers, contemporaries of Conan Doyle's. And then you lean on good old Wikipedia, maybe to give you some reference points to other books you might want to touch upon. And, stuff in Wikipedia isn't necessarily bad, but it is important that you maybe check it with 2 or 3 other sources to make sure that it's backed up. And, those things combined, you can get so much information. And it's not an exaggeration to say that all 3 of my biographies of Conan Doyle lent very heavily on newspapers.
Fantastic. And as we're coming up on the hour, that went very, very fast. I think we'll go to the Q&A window where we have a couple of questions that are coming in. The first one really is, do you think Holmes and Watson are seen as modern heroes? And I guess this puts a nod towards modern adaptations. So if we start with Orlando, are there any of the modern adaptations that you would say are adding to the value of the canon and bringing people to the original stories?
Well, I think there's no such thing as bad publicity. I think that the fact there have been 2 recent ones is pretty extraordinary. 3 recent ones. There's been Robert Downey Jr., there's been Cumberbatch, and there's been Johnny Lee Miller. And to have 3 different takes on a character about whom the last story was written nearly 100 years ago. It's pretty amazing. I think every take is valid. I've not seen anything that's invalid. I don't know what other people think, but I think that they all have their weaknesses, but I think generally they're very strong. And I think that the fact they exist shows the strength of what Conan Doyle created. And there'll be more remakes to come. Good for that.
Susan, anything that particularly made you think that it had transitioned well into the modern era?
There's lots of firework display going off, so I'm a bit distracted by that. No, I must say I'm not a fan of the very modern takes on Sherlock Holmes. My absolute favourite would be Jeremy Brett's interpretation, and so I'm a bit of an old fuddy-duddy when it comes to that. I don't really like Benedict Cumberbatch as Sherlock Holmes and all the modern stuff. But I see that it's got a great appeal, and I've got nothing against it in that respect. You know, it's not for me, but it appeals to other people. And it is, as Orlando said, it's just amazing that there doesn't seem to be any falling off in interest in Sherlock Holmes and his doings in whatever capacity they appear. So, yeah, that's my opinion anyway.
But going across to, I'm going to start with Richard first and then go on to Tom. In terms of the US, where the US fan base with the modern adaptations, do you think it's adding to and bringing people to the original canon?
Absolutely. You know, again, Johnny Lee Miller does something very, very different with Holmes, but I think it's enjoyable. I think it's worthwhile. And, you know, I've always said from the beginning that in order to appreciate what any modern adaptation does, you first have to go back to the source material. So if through Brett or through Johnny Lee Miller or through Benedict Cumberbatch, we draw more readers back to the original canon, then they've served a double purpose, haven't they? They've entertained us, and at the same time, they've attracted new fans for Holmes and Watson.
And Tom, is there a particular favourite of yours in the modern tranche?
Well, I liked Sherlock up to a point. I think it went a little over the top toward the end, but it was a very clever take on the original characters. And I agree with Richard. I think anything that brings more people back to the canon and to Sherlock Holmes generally is a good thing. I will have to say, though, that my own taste is pretty traditional in that I prefer, if not just the original version, at least something as close to it as, say, the Jeremy Brett Granada series back in the 80s. And if I had my choice, I would watch those rather than the modern iterations.
Now, if you were to do you would have to do a second edition, Alistair, of Eliminate the Impossible to catch those particular adaptations, because Eliminate the Impossible was 2009? Eight. Yeah, I was going to get it wrong. But so those adaptations weren't out by then. I guess you did review, though, the adaptations prior to 2008. What would you say were the standouts for you?
Well, before I answer that, it always brings up in my mind that one of my worst reviews for that book on Amazon complains that it doesn't cover Robert Downey Jr., Benedict Cumberbatch, or Johnny Lee Miller. And I think, do people read publication dates? I would have had incredible foresight to write about adaptations that hadn't yet taken place. In terms of adaptations within the scope of my book, you know, I'm a Brett fan, you know, right up to the hilt. I think it's arguably the best adaptation ever done. If you're a traditionalist, I've got nothing against any adaptation. I'll give them all a go once, but I haven't yet seen anything that tops Brett.
Fantastic. And Martin, obviously you're writing about a contemporary. Is there a nice benchmark that you see in some of the modern adaptations?
I agree with everybody. I just can't get past the Granada production. Everything about it, the actors, the supporting cast, the sets. It's like Doyle and Paget being lifted off the page for me, and I just can't see anybody surpassing that. But I do have the capacity to sort of step out of that and enjoy the Guy Ritchie movies, or not so much Benedict Cumberbatch, but nevertheless, I've watched Sherlock as well. One of my wife's favourite adaptation of The Hound was the Richard Roxburgh version. Must have been, what, 10 years ago, 15 years ago or something. And I think that's a good movie. Personally, I don't think they've got either character right in the movie. But it's a good movie on its own merits, as are the Robert Downey Jr. movies. You know, they're a romp. You just get into them, you accept them for what they are. But when I'm in serious Sherlock mood, I just can't go past Brett, Hardwick and Burke. They're just sensational, really. Fantastic.
Fantastic. So we've run out just over the hour. So I think what we'll do is we'll wrap it up with a final comment from each of the panelists. And I'd like you to comment on Holmes and Watson's relevance in the modern world, and why you think they're still relevant. So if we start up the top left-hand corner with Orlando. So why do you think Holmes and Watson still resonate today?
How many people can you recognize by their street number? You just say 221B, you know where you are. And we're in a difficult world at the moment. And I still find the poem by Vincent Starrett inspiring. Here dwelt together still two men of note who have never lived and so can never die. And it's always 1895. And in difficult times, I think Holmes and Watson are the greatest comfort literature, because they present a logical, comfortable world where there are solutions to be had. And our world is anything but that. So to go into a world which does offer that vision is a great place to be. And when I've been sad or tired or having difficulties, I've always gone back to the Conan Doyle stories because they're a great place to be.
That's fantastic. Martin?
Yes, similarly, I think comfort or comfortable are the words, aren't they? It is always 1895, and we always look to step back in our mind to that. I think if we're honest, I would hate to have lived in 1895 in terms of facilities, infrastructure, you know, everything, all the hardship of 1895. Who would want that? But yet, in our mind's eye, we just love going back there, because what we do is we cherry pick all the good stuff, and we're in the comfort of our own home while we're doing it. So, yeah, I think 100 years on and going strong, and 100 years more, and probably more besides, I would have thought. Yeah.
Fantastic. Richard?
I like Martin's point. Yeah, we don't really want to live in 1895. We want the comforts of the 20th century, but we do want to be able to escape, you know, the 21st century every now and then, especially, you know, with the pandemic and everything else that's going on. So when you find a refuge, you take it.
Fantastic. And Susan, from Dublin, is 221B still a refuge from Dublin?
Yeah. And what amuses me actually very much about the Jeremy Brett, well, first of all, I want to say that why Holmes and Watson still attract so much attention and following. I think that's just a genius combination of the rational on the one hand, and then the much more humanizing character of Watson. And you can't help but love Watson because he's such a dear. And I hated the way, I mean, I do very much enjoy the Basil Rathbone series in a way, but the way Dr. Watson appears in that, he's such an idiot. I mean, he's very funny, but he's hopeless, really. But anyway, but back to just what I wanted to say about, you know, you were saying we're taken back to 1895. What gets me about the Jeremy Brett and most of any period costume drama is they're always so clean. The streets would have been filthy, and the fog and the smog and the rubbish on the streets and everything, and everyone is even the Baker Street irregulars are not that dirty, are they? So it's from that point of view, it's not very realistic, but it's very charming anyway, and as you say, very comforting.
Fantastic. And Tom?
Well, I would kind of echo, I think, part of what Susan said. To me, the thing that stands out for Holmes and Watson, and the thing that really keeps them timeless in a way, is the friendship between the two of them. I mean, they are so different, but the loyalty and the character that both men show is something that I think we need nowadays, the kind of morality and loyalty to each other, and putting maybe the good of the world first, insofar as they could, is something that is, I find, very attractive. And I think the best adaptations have captured that. I agree. I mean, it was a long time before Watson lived down Nigel Bruce, poor Nigel Bruce. And the Granada series, I think one of the best things it did was to make a real man out of Dr. Watson instead of just a buffoon. And the character of the two is something that I think is timeless and maybe one of the best contributions of Conan Doyle's writing, because we need that kind of person now just as much as that kind of person was needed then.
And everything started with Mr. Duncan back in 2008, and now it's going to finish with Mr. Duncan. So you probably know Conan Doyle better than anybody else on the panel. Why do you think what he's written is just endured so much?
I think because it's a world you can still reach out and touch. We're 130 years beyond the sort of rough time when these were all set. And yet, if you're lucky enough to be within arm's length of London, you can still walk those streets. Most of the buildings are still there. This is what I discovered when I was writing Close to Home's, my little sort of travel guide to London locations. So much of it is still there. And I think it's much better when you can really walk the streets, as opposed to an out and out fictional universe where you can never directly experience it. You can, if you're in reach of London, you can go and stand outside what might be 221B Baker Street. You can go to railway stations mentioned in the stories. So I think it's really great that you can walk in their footsteps.
Fantastic. It just remains for me to thank our panelists, Orlando, Susan, Martin, Tom, Richard, and Alistair. Thank you for an absolutely fantastic and fascinating discussion. And I look forward to catching up with all of you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Steve. Bye-bye.